Welcome to another instalment of Talking History for 2021. Now, we're just waiting for a number of people who are still entering the webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christy Kokiki. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the History Trust of South Australia. And it's my pleasure to have been bringing you Talking History online since early 2020 when COVID first hit. Now, we've still got people streaming in, but we will just get started given we're at 5:30. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we're broadcasting to you on tonight is the land of the Kaurna people, and that I'm personally coming to you from Kaurna land. I'd also like to acknowledge that the History Trust of South Australia, who produces Talking History, we respect the primary place of Aboriginal people in the history of this place. We acknowledge that our story commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the new province of South Australia and established colonial government in 1836, and that Aboriginal people have a long history that extends millennia into the past. Okay, so we've still got a few people streaming in. I know we had a lot of, maybe it had something to do with the fact that South Australia is going into a COVID lockdown this evening in about half an hour, but we've had a lot of people sign up for this webinar late this afternoon. So we will have people still joining us now. Like I said, my name's Christy Kokigi, Director of Public Engagement at the History Trust. Many of you have attended one of our Talking Histories before. We've been really fortunate to have a couple of Talking Histories in person this year, but generally we've had a hybrid approach, and most of them have stayed online just because we have people that join us from regional South Australia, from all over Australia, and I think at almost every Talking History we've hosted monthly since about April last year. We've also had international guests joining us for these sessions. So it's really lovely to be here with so many of you from all over the place. Now, I'm just checking the chat as well. I think we might have a little bit of a problem with some people getting in. So I'm just going to go through some of the formalities tonight while we're sorting that. Now, obviously, South Australia goes into a lockdown at 6 o'clock tonight, which means our whole entire team, we were hoping to bring you tonight's Talking History from the National Motor Museum, which would have been fabulous. That's not possible, and it also means our technical team is zooming into you from their homes, which means we don't have all our usual equipment or the usual infrastructure. So bear with us if we run into any technical difficulties tonight. And if you're in a stormy part of the world and you lose connection, please don't panic. Our technical team behind the scenes, Catherine and Jade, will help you get back in. And if we really do lose you, this session is being recorded and we will put it up on our YouTube channel within a couple of weeks for you to see. Okay, so for those of you who know the drill, who have been to our Talking Histories before, this is the bit where I talk about the format of the webinar. So if you haven't got your refreshments ready for this evening, now's your chance, because I'm going to be talking for another couple of minutes. You'll have all checked your own emergency exits, you know where your own toilets are, and it's up to you whether you turn your mobile phones onto silent. The format tonight, we're going to have a 45-minute presentation from Don Loffler and Mick Bolognese, who I'll introduce to you in greater detail in a moment. This is a webinar, which means you can see the speakers, you can see the screens that they share, but you can't see each other. We regularly get more than 100 people attending these webinars, so you can't see each other, you can't talk, there's no video for attendees. That's why it's really important to use the chat. It's nice to know where everyone's from, that everyone's here enjoying the talk. So for those of you who can, jump onto the chat, tell us where you're from, where in South Australia or Australia, tell us why you're here, what you're interested in. And we always export the chat at the end of Talking History for the speakers to read through all your lovely comments. So please do that. Great. We've already got some. We've got someone from the US, and I noticed before we have someone with a. Oh wow! So yeah, we've got a few people with Holdens in the chat. So please tell us why you're here and what you love about Holdens. Another really important point, given that this is a webinar and not a Zoom meeting, is if we're at the end of the presentations, we'll have questions. Please don't put your questions in the chat. By the end, there will be hundreds and hundreds of items in the chat. There is a special Q&A function in the webinar down the bottom. Please put your questions in there so that we can sort them and we can ensure that Mick and Don are able to answer them at the end. And if someone's asked a question that is similar to what you would like to know, please give it a thumbs up, vote it up so we know which ones to ask first in case we run out of time. Look, I've already given a little bit of a shout out to the fabulous team behind the scenes that manages all the tech, especially given the challenges we have tonight. So Catherine and Jade, thank you very much. You can't see them, but they make everything work behind the scenes. So the session is being recorded and it will be available on our SoundCloud and our YouTube account by the end of the month. That doesn't include chat or Q&A, what you type into the Q&A. So please don't be afraid to contribute in those ways. Now, also just a quick word for anyone in the chat. When you are chatting, if you want to chat with everyone, if you want everyone to be able to see what you're contributing, please make sure that in the to field you've selected all panelists and attendees. For some people, it defaults to just panelists, which means only myself, Catherine, Don, Mick, and Jade can see. So make sure it's to all panelists and attendees so everyone gets the sense of who else is in the room. Okay, well, I think we've had quite a number have jumped in now. We may have some people still trying to get in, but like I said, this is being recorded. No one's going to miss out. So now I would like to just introduce our speakers tonight. We have Holden's historian Don Loffler, who's the author of a number of hugely successful books on Holden cars, and is widely regarded as one of Australia's foremost authorities on early Holdens. And recently his work was recognised at the annual Historian of the Year Awards, where he was awarded the Lifelong Historians Award for his work on Holdens and the research into its place in South Australia's and Australia's history. And I understand, Don, you've published a number of books, but you're currently completing an expanded two-volume version of your first book, She's a Beauty. So I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested in that when it is out. And then we have Mick Bolognese, who's the senior curator at the National Motor Museum, where he's been the senior curator for a number of years, 5 years or so, and it's been our pleasure and my pleasure indeed to work with him across the History Trust for a number of years. He leads a team at the National Motor Museum that works to preserve, research and present the world's most important collection of Australian motoring heritage, which we hold at the National Motor Museum. And he's curated a number of exhibitions on the subject of Holden's long history in Australia. And it turns out that when he was 16, he actually turned down an offer of a free old Holden Kingswood as his first car because it wasn't cool enough. But now here we have him tonight speaking with Don on Holden's Heroes, the amazing history of Australia's own car. So I will throw to Mick and Don to tell us some more. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy, for that great introduction. And I've got to say, I admire your commitment. I just realised you're at home and you've still managed to get the History Trust of South Australia pull-up banner in the background, so that's pretty impressive. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint that I prepared earlier. And by the way, everyone, please forgive if this doesn't run quite as smoothly as we would have hoped. As Christy's already mentioned, Don and I were really hoping to bring this session a little bit more interactively from inside the National Motor Museum, where we do have an incredible collection of Holdens at the moment. The exhibition, same title as the talk, Holden Heroes, a retrospective 1948 to 2017, is just that, it contains the best collection of Holden vehicles kept by the company themselves, now General Motors Australia New Zealand, who have parked them on loan with us at least until the end of the year, but we hope for a lot longer. So some of you, and by the way, I also realized as this introduction was unfolding that 16-year-old me that we heard about earlier, who thought a Kingswood was a very ugly, ungainly and extremely uncool car, is definitely dead, because I'm reading all your little comments in the chat about what Holdens you own, and every time I'm getting a little kick out of it. So I've become a Holden fan. And now, some of you who are joining us tonight might be complete Holden aficionados. I noticed someone said they've got a swathe of them in their garage. And you think that Holden's the greatest thing that's ever happened to Australia, and you just want to hear us rave about the company. And some of you might be coming along from a broader historical point of view and wanting to find out why the history of Holden is so important to the 20th century in Australia, and indeed going into the 21st century. Someone who can address both of those points particularly well is Don Loffler. So Christy's already introduced Don. My credentials absolutely pale in comparison. He's a very modest man, but he's undoubtedly one of the foremost authorities on early Holdens in particular. And it's great that he's going to be able to, I guess, talk a little bit about those very first Holdens. And by the way, you can see just in the background of my very first slide, that is the #1 Holden, the very first one off the line. Me, I look at the big picture. So I'm the National Motor Museum Senior Curator. It's Australian motoring history in general that I deal with. So I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none, which means if I get the cubic centimetre capacity of some of the engines wrong, please forgive me, I have to remember so many makes and models. But in that big picture of Australian motoring history, Holden has obviously occupied a lot of my efforts. So I'm going to throw to Don now. Don, you can tell us, I think, from the very origins of Holden about how this company came to be such a household name in Australia.
Well, Mick, it had very humble beginnings, because in 1859, James Alexander Holden set up a humble leather goods business in the Beehive Corner building, and prospered so greatly that he moved from one premises to another, and finally ended up in Grenfell Street, where the car park for Harrod Scarf is now. And that was a very big business then. And his son Henry went into partnership with Adolf Frost, and so their firm was called Holden and Frost. And you can see what they were doing: trimming, making harnesses, everything for the horse and buggy era. And I love that photo. They had a big horse up on the balcony there. And I think, Mick, the head of it still exists, doesn't it? I think so.
Yeah, I believe that Holden themselves have it, and I don't believe, I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. It was once in the entrance of the Elizabeth plant. Yes. I don't know actually right now what's happened to it.
Yeah. Now, do you know, I look at that photo and I can't see Henry Holden or Adolf Frost somehow. Perhaps I'm not looking right, but you can see it's a big group of employees. And they then prospered so much that they began to make a few custom bodies for cars. Then in 1917, they really did branch out then. And while this Grenfell Street firm still went on as Holden and Frost, their other company, Holden's Motor Body Builders, started in King William Street South, number 400. And that's where the bodybuilding started then for cars. That prospered so much, can you believe this, that by 1922, they'd outgrown the site, which was huge. And in 1923, they managed to secure this huge triangle of land at Woodville. where they set up their bodybuilding plant. Theoretically, it was only for General Motors bodies, but in practice, they did other makes as well. You can see on this photograph here how a car body at that time had a wooden frame. So the metal panels were attached to it. It's a very labor-intensive type of work. And then what about the next one, Mick? I love that photograph because it's one of the few that shows the large employment of women in the trim shop. And here they are attaching their seat springs to each other. And what a job that was. You can imagine how many hours it took just to get one seat finally assembled and trimmed with its leather covering. Quite wonderful. You can see the styles there too, can't you? Love the hairstyles. Next one. What have we got now? Oh, yes. So in 1944, General Motors agreed that General Motors Holdens here could produce a local car. And I want to tell you that although we can see the managing director, Harold Bettel, third from left, I reckon the hero is the man on the right, Arthur Wigan, the supply manager. Yeah, that one there. Because he had to manage to get 304 component suppliers to agree to produce components for the Holden car. Now, at Woodville, they produced an enormous amount themselves, and at Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne too, but they still had to get all those suppliers organised to produce this car, and it was against enormous difficulties. There were shortages of iron and steel, coke, coal for their furnace, skilled labour, building materials. That was everything they needed to expand their factories to put this extra car into production. And that they managed to achieve this by October the 1st was a tremendous achievement. And okay, the whole firm cooperated, but I still think that Arthur Wigan is the hero of the day. Now, that car was completed under top secret conditions. Nobody was to know anything about it outside of the company, apart from its name. So this is October the 1st. Now, the company was hard up against it because they knew that on November the 29th, Prime Minister Chifley was coming down to unveil the car to the public. So the pressure was on the company to really get this into production. Now, this car was the first of 10 that they ran off the line just to test how good the line was and make the final adjustments. So between October the 1st and the end of October, they tested these 10 cars day and night. And then because they were assembled often on the line, they didn't have a really good photo of the whole 10 going down the line. I don't know why they didn't do it, but that's just one of those mysteries. Anyway, they decided to have a ceremonial drive off the line at the end of October, where they've got a whole line of Holdens available. And there we can see Harold Bettel and the chief engineer, Russell Begg, driving that number one car, the one you see in Birdwood, number one car off the line. What a moment that was. Since the earliest 1900s, people had tried to launch an Australian-built car Every attempt had failed, and here at last, General Motors Holdings had succeeded with this very clever recipe of a car not too small like the popular English cars, not too large like the popular Americans, but right in the middle of an empty market spot. Just brilliant. So what have we, oh yes, and there's the car now. So that car was never sold to the public. The other 9 cars were eventually, but luckily this one has been kept. And it was in the museum here from 1985 until 1998. It underwent a restoration in 1998 in Melbourne and came back here for a while. Then it went back to Melbourne for a while. Now it's back here at the museum. So it's had a lot of travels with not many miles on the odometer.
And I think the apocryphal tale possibly, Don, is that I always say it's very hard to know that you're making history when you're making it. And you'd think a company that's launching the very first ever Australian or fully Australian built vehicle for mass production in 1948, just after the war, momentous occasion, big ceremony, the Prime Minister coming along, you'd think they would have realized that they were making history, but no. Apparently, this very car, the #1 Holden off the line, was then parked in Holden's design studio, their experimental design warehouse. And when their staff members were working overtime, supposedly they needed a place to crash and they slept in the back seat.
Oh, they did. I've spoken to one of the prototype drivers who did just that. He said, oh, it had lovely seats because that car wasn't trimmed in leather, it was trimmed in cloth. Nice, cozy car because he loved to just have a nap in there in between the test periods. Now, Mick, we've got to make it clear to people that there's no mystery about that car having body 6. Some people get terribly uptight about it. They want to call it number 6. Well, it's not. It's body 6, but it's car #1. A body is not a car. Now, it just happened that they took no notice of body number when they were assembling those first 10 cars. Remember that 7 of them were black, 1 was dark blue, 1 was dark grey, and this one was Gawler cream. So in a dark factory, this is obviously the most photogenic of the cars. Now, that may not be why it came first off the line, but for whatever reason, it did. And so I will not hear that called number 6. Thank you very much. It is #1.
And well, we planned on bringing this entire lecture, or the first half of it anyway, from a desk that I was going to set up very nicely in front of #1 Holden. It is a bit of a special place to sit, or I sometimes just stand and take it all in when I'm passing through the museum, because really is where it all began for the Australian motoring industry. So obviously the industry was older, as Don mentioned. Holden were actually producing a very large amount of car bodies because earlier in time there were tariffs and import bans on fully assembled vehicles. So Holden really found a niche, I suppose, in bodying foreign-built, mainly American-built vehicles. So the chassis and drivetrain would arrive in a box and they'd fit a body over it. They in 1926, I think, they had their sale numbers had slumped all the way down in the wake of the Great Depression, of the Depression at the time. And they were bought out by General Motors. So it took them a little while following World War II, not very long at all, in fact, to build this vehicle. So, 45 to 48 is not a huge amount of time. And in fact, as Don said, the project began in 44. But just there's a slide there. I just included this picture because it's a little bit, it's a curio, but the vehicle in the foreground is a child's toy, as you've probably identified, a pedal car, and some of you probably might be of the age bracket where you've had a pedal car. like that. This was actually brought into the museum on a day. I can't remember what we were doing that day, but we had some special event going, and it's not my favorite thing in the world to have someone come along to me and say, I've got an object for the museum in the back of my car, and it's here right now, and please come and take it, because we have processes to adhere to. The person was an elderly chap who was given this as a Christmas present all the way in 1945, when he was, I don't know, 7 years old or something. And it's actually a Holden built pedal car. It wouldn't originally have had a Holden badge on it, and there's a bit of a story behind that, but I can't go into it. But the interesting thing here is that Holden had already decided that they were going to be building this stunning vehicle behind, and that they would start turning their hand to full-scale automotive production. But they weren't far enough down the track. You know, they were still in the design and tool up stage. And there were a lot of people still working at the factory who had previously been building or manufacturing munitions for the war, and they needed a job, and Holden needed some money and to generate some cash flow. So they built a series of these pedal cars. They're quite rare, and this one here came to us in fantastic condition, but most importantly to us, it had excellent provenance. It was, you know, that person who donated it to us then passed it on to his kids and then to his grandkids, and didn't think it was worth trying to go through one more generation. He thought it was worth donating it to the museum. I'm very grateful that he did. So that's the number one. Now, very interestingly, with the and Don mentioned how difficult it was to coordinate the manufacture of a vehicle for the very first time in this way in Australia. All sorts of, you know, a car company doesn't fabricate every single thing that's in a car. So a lot of coordination involved. In the first year, they only managed to build just over 300 of them from memory. By the following year, they had already started building, towards the end of it, they were building 600 of them a day. They were very cleverly branded, I think, those early Holdens, as Australia's own car. It was certainly the case with the 48215, and then it was very much a tagline with the FJ, which is the following series, and probably a car that's remembered even more fondly in sort of Australian collective memory. So the Australia's own car, basically they couldn't produce them quickly enough. So this is 1948. The following slide, this is the People magazine, which is one of the many the internal publications of Holden's, but they're probably the one that's most widely circulated. It was across all the plants. It was about Holden in general and not any specific part of the company. So if you look at the date here, November 1962, it's nearly exactly 14 years after they've produced their first vehicle. And here they are unveiling the 1 millionth Holden. It's an EJ, and I'll show you what it looks like now, because we have this one in the museum as well. But in that same issue of the People magazine, where they're celebrating their millionth car produced, they had this little lift out, which has their 14 years in numbers, I guess. And I just wanted to bring people's attention. You probably won't be able to read it. But two figures. So here it says first Holden on November 29, 1948. And production by 1949 exceeds 600 a day. And they reckon they sold 7,725 cars in 1949. That's a reasonable amount. And, you know, the post-war boom is just beginning at that point. Fast forward to 1961, they're selling 112,377 cars in the 1 year. So I think it's fair to say that the take-up of Holden is pretty amazing. They're a success story and a completely upwards trajectory in those first 20 years or so. In fact, another figure that's in here, 46.2% of registrations of new passenger cars in Australia in 1961 are EK Holdens. That means almost 1 in every 2 cars sold in that year was that one model of car. As Don said, they had found that niche in the market, that perfectly untapped space that everyone wanted, and it was effectively the perfect family car at the time. In fact, 1961 is 1 year after Ford unveiled its very first Falcon, and that hegemony was about to be challenged quite strongly by Ford. And then Holden and Ford famously shared basically a duel over the Australian car market for the next sort of 40 or 50 years. You can see, I didn't have a, sorry, I thought I had a better photograph of what the EJ looks like right now, the 1 millionth Holden, but there it is in our exhibition, just in the background of this photograph. And in the foreground is the 2 millionth Holden, which once again would have been unveiled in the same kind of ceremony and celebrated in the People magazine. And, you know, congratulations to us, we've built 2 million cars. The important thing to note in this picture is the date that's just visible here on the label for the vehicle in the exhibition, 1969. So the difference between these two cars is 7 years. The difference between the 1 millionth and the first car is 14 years. So they've built another million cars in 7 short years, which means that, like I said, it is a constantly upwards trajectory. Holden is effectively growing and growing and growing. Once again, they were outgrowing factories in Adelaide in the early period of the 1910s and 20s, almost faster than they could move in. They've already at this point moved into their Elizabeth factory, and Woodville operations continued all the way up until the very late 80s, I think, and it was demolished in, I think, 1991. But they've moved into a whole new factory, and they're building and building and building. It's a real period of optimism. It's the period of the famous jingle, or in fact, that came in 1975, but football, meat pies, kangaroos, and Holden cars. You know, Holden in some way has become one of the most Australian names and concepts around. In this time is when in 1964, they opened the design studio. In this time is when they start producing these fantastic prototypes that were mentioned in the blurb for this talk. The prototypes, I'm not going to go too deep. I'm actually a mechanical engineer by my first upbringing. I'm not going to go too deep into the merits of these prototypes in that sense, but they're very, very interesting in a broader historical context anyway. So this is the Hurricane. So lots of people have seen this vehicle before. I always tell people when I take them through the museum that it looks like it's just landed on the moon, not just because of its amazing sort of sparkly orange paintwork, but just, you know, the shape. We're in that sort of space age. Everything's inspired by the slightly earlier moon landing, and the Hurricane was not built ever to go to market. They didn't think that there would be too much of an uptake of a very expensive to build, very tech-heavy, wedge-shaped race car. And they were probably right. We have one person in the entire National Motor Museum who can fit into the cockpit of this vehicle. When that roof comes down, it's really cozy in there. But it was never intended for market. It was intended a little bit to show off. Obviously, they landed on a really good design, a little bit to show what their design studio could do. So 1964, they've only just launched the studio, which was basically where they developed the models that were to come. And you know, they were upskilling. They were showing off, but they were also teaching their staff, saying, you know, have free reign and go and see what you can build. And some of those technologies then filter down to the vehicles that do make it to market. So this vehicle in particular, for example, has a very contentious GPS system in it. Very few believe that it ever, well, actually hardly anyone believes that it ever worked. I think not many people even believe that they tried to actually develop it, but it was a good concept. It was meant to work on the magnets that are in your that are placed in the roads that sort of activate the traffic lights. But a wayfinding system in 1969 was pretty groundbreaking. What does work in it is the reverse camera. So it had a fully working reverse camera, which was not a first for the 60s. I think the first reverse camera was in a 1940s car, production car, I think a LaSalle. But it was still quite rare, and it does still work. We used it when we parked the vehicle into this exact spot in the museum last year when we launched the exhibition. We used the reverse camera, so it definitely worked. But yeah, like I said, it was hugely technologically advanced with that hydraulically lifting, mechanically lifting roof. Technologically advanced, but not intended for production. What was intended for production, and here's some more photos of the Hurricane just looking cool. What was intended for production was the vehicle that's next to it in our exhibition, which is the Holden Tirana GTRX. So this is 1970, so it's just 1 year later. And originally the vehicle wasn't this lovely pearlescent white color. It was a sort of a steely gray that wasn't quite as pretty, but still a very stunning vehicle. And they thought it was going to make it to production so much that they actually, it's just a promotional shot of it. They even made sales brochures for it. So the Tirana is a model of Holden that was launched a little bit earlier in the 60s, and it had already had its own sort of muscle car versions or performance versions. So the GTRX was meant to be the ultimate, sort of the Holden supercar. And like I said, they went so far down the track of actually manufacturing it that they made sales brochures, but they was ultimately considered not to be a financially viable product. But ultimately, I think what this shows, this 1960s, 70s era, is just a whole lot of optimism. You know, you don't try your hand at vehicles and develop things that you don't even think are ever going to make it sale without having, I guess, an idea that your company is going places. And that was, you know, very much rooted in how they were performing at the time. So from the 1960s and 70s are when many of those iconic models, I don't have pictures of, I'm afraid, but they're probably present in your mind, came. So the Sandman, the Monaro, the Kingswood, these are all launched in that period of the kangaroos, football meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars. So in this era, Holden is certainly performing admirably well, but it's destined to end. So the 1970s, the late 70s is when repeated oil crises hit the world. People are starting to worry a little bit about the consumption, because obviously these vehicles had mostly 6 or 8 cylinder engines that didn't really focus very much on fuel efficiency, and they're becoming expensive to run. There's also a huge, I guess, a huge increase in the acceptance in Australia of Japanese-built cars in particular. So I was watching just the other day a promotional video for the XU1 Tirana, where they're saying it almost looks like a Datsun. It's almost saying it's almost as good as those Japanese designs. So the force of the Japanese competitors is really something to be reckoned with for Holden. And that's why I think you don't see any products of the design studio that come from that era. They were still producing, they were doing things, but what they were doing was rebadging, sort of facelifting is what it's called technically, facelifting their current models so that the public would still continue to buy them without having to spend huge amounts of money on the development of brand new vehicles. So basically, this is the first signs of that upward trajectory starting to really go on the down. And the 1980s were not a particularly happy period for Holden. Chose to show this photograph, not just because it's a pretty picture of what we display in the National Motor Museum. This is effectively the Holden Heroes exhibition, but because it shows a good timeline. So here on our left, or my left, that's the millionth vehicle. So we have the EJ I was talking about earlier, the 2 millionth, the 4, 6, and 7 millionth vehicles are all there that the company built. Don't ask me about the 3 and 5th millionth, they're not to be found. And on this side are all the prototypes. So the Hurricane and the Effigy I showed earlier. The next one in the series, chronologically, is not until 1998. And you might recognize this vehicle. It's the only one in the whole series that ever actually made it as a full production car. It became the latest series of Monaro that we might remember from the late 90s and early 2000s. So between 1970 and 1998, there's no real products to speak of from that Holden design studio. And, oops, sorry, switching through my notes. But when they did restart, well, then you see that there's quite a long list of them. So 1998 is the Monaro, or the prototype was named Matilda. It had a topless counterpart called Marilyn, which I think is the most elegant of all the vehicles in this collection. And then a whole series of other prototypes. So this one is the Tirana, or a future series of Tirana, the TT36, which is 2004. Sorry, my cursor keeps getting lost. This is a HR Holden Racing Team version of the Monaro, which I think is from 2002. Sorry, I might get my dates wrong. This is the SSX, which is a type of hatchback Commodore almost. This is the Utster. Once again, we're in the early 2000s. So the Utster is a bit of a almost a cabrio ute thing. This is a later series of Sandman, and then on to the very famous Effigy 2005, and ending with a Coupe 60 in 2008. So we've got sort of, was it 8 vehicles, 9 vehicles, all in the space of about 10 years. And that's because in that period, the late 90s and early 2000s, Holden had once again established itself as one of the most profitable global division of General Motors, so its parent company, General Motors. And I actually moved to Australia from Italy in 2001. And when I came to this country, I genuinely it would not have surprised me if someone told me that a Holden Commodore is standard issue for an Australian family. They were absolutely ubiquitous in 2001. And that was, I think, a slow build. You know, it was a model that lasted from 1978 with the VC, which you can actually see just right at the back there. VB, sorry, right at the back there. All the way through to the early 2000s when I'm talking about, with the VT or VS. It was a model that had always proven popular. It was a large family car. It was very much the taste of the time. Moving here to the Effigy. Yeah, and I'll pass on to Don quickly to talk a little bit about the Effigy and Holden's heritage. But that I guess that focus on the large family car is certainly one of the main factors that ultimately contributed to the end of Holden production as we know it. But Don, I know you're a big admirer of the Effigy as an FJ owner yourself. What can you tell us about the prototype?
Well, I think Richard Palazzo, the designer, did a brilliant job, because there are so many FJ cues in the car. Look at the front. The grille is just so recognizably FJ. Look at the badge, the teeth in the grille. Then you look a little bit further, yes, where your pointer is, the script on the side of the car, the Holden name. Oh, we've lost him.
Sorry, I thought I had another photo with the FJ and the Effigy side by side, but I'll go back. I don't.
And then as you move back, then the FJs had a rubber stone guard to protect the rear guard. This has a gleaming metal piece there, but unmistakable cue to the FJ. And then at the rear, the tail light is just so pure FJ again. And even though that's such a dramatic creation, it's unmistakably FJ. I think it's brilliant. And that car, by the way, was taken to the United States and caused a huge sensation there. People, the Americans, I don't think they thought something like that could ever come out of Australia. And or to use a common expression, knocked their socks off.
Yeah, and I think on its way back from that trip, I know this because I've heard it from the designer himself, Richard Palazzo, the father of the Effigy, that a billionaire in Saudi Arabia offered Holden, he started bidding on it basically, and he kept saying, no, it's not for sale. And I think he got all the way up to $20 million US for a vehicle that they estimated cost them about 1.2 million to build, and they still said, no, it's not for sale. So we're pretty lucky to have it in the National Motor Museum. But I think I've included this shot here because it contains all of the millionths and the very last Holden. And I did see there is a question in the Q&A about that last Holden, and we will address that at the end in as diplomatic a way as I can. But Don, you had some thoughts about the company's efforts to collect and preserve these vehicles.
Yes, the one. Well, let's go back a little bit further. The 500,000th Holden, which is an FC wagon, the 1 millionth, the 2 millionth, and the 3 millionth cars were all presented to the Australian Inland Mission. They were gifted. Now, I'm just thinking they're going to Central Australia, they're going to outback Queensland, and they get these really smart cars, which probably is almost a contradiction in terms, isn't it? That the mission would have these really smart cars, but anyway, they were donated. Now, what fascinates me, Mick, is that Holden's managed to get the 1 millionth and 2 millionth back. Now, I do not know the story behind that, and I'd love to know, because those cars would have had a fairly rough time. I'm sure they were driven over unsealed roads a great deal. And it's only the 3 millionth that met a sad fate, and was trashed. But these other two, of course, are magnificently restored. And I think all credit to Holden's to have done that. Whereas I think the later big round number cars were kept, were they not? I don't think they were gifted.
No, yeah, you're right. These later ones, I think possibly including the VC Commodore there, which is my favourite paintwork in the entire museum. The two-tone gold with a pinstripe is just
Mick, that's the one that Lawrence Hartnett drove off the line, isn't it?
Yes.
The design, the original, or the so-called father of the Holden car, fell out with Holden's over the styling. We've got to just remember that the recipe, so to speak, for the Holden was his. It was his idea to have this car in between, the middle-sized car. He had done huge research. And so although Holden was designed in America, it was done to Hartnett's specification. And that's the brilliance of it. We've got to credit him with the brilliance of that Holden. And it was just sad that he would not compromise on the styling. He wanted it more advanced. And I just think it's tragic that he threw up his career just because he couldn't get his way with the styling. And his own car style that he wanted was really just plain ugly. And I don't blame the Americans. I'm thrilled the Americans rejected it. But we have to acknowledge that. And sadly, he wasn't even invited to the launch of the Holden. So he was estranged from the company. But look, they mended bridges, and when the 4 millionth came off the line, it was nice symbolism that they allowed him to drive that off the line.
Yeah, and so as Don mentioned, their efforts to retrieve these significant early vehicles, I think they indicate, and Holden are a subsidiary of a large global company, but ultimately the people who worked on the vehicles here, including the upper management, always have this strong. I went to the Holden factory at Elizabeth many times before it closed. And one thing that you just couldn't, you just felt it from the moment you walked in. Everyone who talked to you, there was this huge sense of pride around what they did and what they had achieved in the past. And that's not just from people who had worked there forever, but you'd find that even if someone was fresh, they were influenced very quickly by the rest of them. As being one, a place where you might not always, I'm not going to say it was all roses there. I'm sure there were people who had all sorts of problems. But one thing they were, I think, pretty assured of is that the product that they were building was very high quality, and so that emphasis on their heritage was always very obvious. And the fact that they laboured with the National Motor Museum and others to preserve it all and to now display it, as you can see, at the National Motor Museum. And it would be remiss of me not to invite everyone who's currently watching and has never been to the museum to see this exhibition to come and see it in person, because it's a different experience. But yeah, obviously it was, you know, it was very close to the company as well to make sure that
yeah,
was preserved.
yeah. Mick,
I know we're not enormously rich in time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. So I thought I should just make some quick mentions about this vehicle, which is the last Holden off the line, and which is why it sits on a pretty red section of the floor, rather than grey like the rest. Oh, sorry, I've skipped too far ahead. So this is the last car. It's the same one that's in this photograph and this promotional shot. And I was saying before, when I was having a quick chat to Don and Catherine before the lecture started, historians always get criticised if they don't get into the political side of things, and I'm certainly not one to shy away from that. And you know, it is a very contentious argument. Why did manufacturing of motor vehicles end in Australia? Why did Holden have to pull out? And I genuinely believe that we're actually, it's, you know, this photograph was taken 4 years ago, October 2017, not even 4 years ago. I think it's all too fresh for us to really know. And it is quite a nuanced argument, and it does have its roots. You know, like I said, the 1980s were already a bit of a dark period for Holden. And there are a variety of factors. There's undoubtedly there is that falling protection that the industry had in time played its part. And like I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, there was huge tariffs and strong import bans on foreign-built vehicles. The government did everything they could to make sure that industry could thrive in Australia, to the detriment of foreign-built vehicles. There was, of course, increased competition, and you know, the Japanese cars definitely took Australia by storm. And I think already by the time I arrived in 2001 in Australia, the Commodore was still leading sales, but not for long, and the Corolla was soon to overtake it. But then, of course, there's the fact that Holden ultimately is a reasonably small part of a large global picture, which is General Motors, and General Motors themselves went bankrupt in 2009. So you know, they obviously they were doing what was best for them as a global unit as well. And often the company would have made certain decisions on a global scale that might not have had the best effects for the Australian market. And so we already saw, like I said, in 2001, when I arrived in Australia, yeah, sure, the Commodore was big, but pretty soon, or in fact, they were already around. Foreign-built Barinas, which were actually rebadged Opel Astras, were already quite popular in Australia. And ultimately, I think it's fair to say that the Australian buying public didn't love the foreign-built Holdens in the same way that they love the Kingswoods and the Monaros and the Commodores. And then, you know, there's my battle horse, SUVs. SUVs have taken Australia by storm, and Holden didn't really have that same sort of SUV range that some of its competitors did, and that's not where they put all their chips, and ultimately that obviously was a factor as well. But I think with all these debates, people often forget what's a big part of this picture, this exact picture in front of us. This is the last car, but these are all the people that were involved in making that last car. All the people at Holden, and the people side of the story is often forgotten in all those discussions. And that's part of the reason that we at the National Motor Museum have recently, only last month, opened a new exhibition called Holden and Me, which is part of a larger oral history project that's supported by the Australian Research Council, and with a bunch of other institutions, Adelaide University, Monash University, and State Library, Holden themselves. And it's collecting 100 oral histories of workers who worked at the Holden factories, and that's across not all of Australia. It's only Victoria and South Australia. And because we're in current COVID times, we focused very much on people who worked at the South Australian factories. So this is one of the objects, or in fact 5 of the objects that are in that exhibition. They are a sewing kit and some trimmer's tools from a gentleman called Alf Matthews. Now, Alf is the chap in this photograph here. He started as an apprentice at Holden, I think in 1916. So all the way before they were even really building, they had actually built a couple of automotive bodies at that time, but not very many of them. He was only a young lad. I think he was 12 years old. And then he worked at Holden's. This chap over here, whose actual name I've forgotten, he also worked at Holden's, and their two kids worked at Holden's, and they got married whilst working at the factory. And they had kids who worked at Holden's. That's an intergenerational story. These are Joan and David, who might even be watching because they've become Don's biggest fans. And that's an intergenerational story of Holden that is not actually that uncommon. I have a Holden family history. My mother worked there in her holidays when she was a university student, and her uncle and auntie worked there as maintenance. My great uncle was a foreman, and his wife worked in maintenance as well. It's not an uncommon story. So many of us have, go 1 or 2 degrees of separation. We have a Holden story. And if we don't have one of the people who worked at the factories, we have one of owning a Holden or being that stupid 16-year-old kid who rejects a Kingswood that would now be worth tens of thousands of dollars. So I just thought that was a nice place to end the lecture, that there is a strong Holden people history that goes alongside the cars, and that's important to remember. So thanks so much, Don, for joining me.
No, my pleasure.
Christy.
Yeah, look, thank you, Bo and Mick. I mean, that was fabulous and such a nice deep dive into not only those people's stories, which are so important, and such an amazing story that the National Motor Museum tells, but those early days of the saddlery business and right through to the iconic years of the Sandman and the Monaro and the Kingswood, which is what I remember from my father and growing up in Australia. Like, everyone does have that personal connection and that personal story, right through to obviously to the impact of the winding down of Holden's production in South Australia, and that really complex global story and picture, and all of the forces at play there. So thank you. We've had some really fabulous comments in the chat that we're keeping track of. Someone's noticed themselves in an original photo that you showed earlier, Mick, and there's been some really, really great stuff. But we have also an awful lot of questions in the Q&A, which we'll just get straight to, because no one wants to hear me talk about my stories. Now, the first one, which has got quite a few upvotes actually, and I'm going to have to read it word for word because I'm not familiar with Holden's models. So Ryan asks, and it's been upvoted a lot, Don made mention that number 1 is actually body number 6. What are your thoughts on the last SSV Redline not being the last car to be made, the last body to be made and to leave paint shop recently, which recently sold for $800,000?
I'm going to I could almost get if my outdoor area wasn't so poorly lit right now, I could hold my laptop up and show the body of a 1974 Vespa that is absolutely in parts. The engine is currently lying with the rest of the drivetrain in a wheelie bin in lots of little bags. That's not a motorcycle or a scooter. It's a body, it's unassembled. So that's my thoughts. Yes, it is true that the vehicle that was auctioned off did have the last body built by Holden. We're talking a matter of minutes or days, whatever it was, between that and the vehicle that we have in our museum. But I don't think anyone questions the fact that the vehicle that the company chose to retain was the very last one that was finished. And people don't buy bodies, they buy finished vehicles. So that's where I stand. But I mean, ultimately, people can make their own minds up. I don't contend that the person who bought that vehicle for $800,000 or whatever it was knows they have a significant piece of Australian motoring history. They do. There's someone probably driving around who has the first Holden ever built on Christmas Day, and they don't know that they have it, or whatever. There are lots of ways that we can interpret what history is significant to us. So I won't pick a fight with the auction house, but that's my thoughts.
I think that's a brilliant answer. Yeah, look, and just sort of following on from that, because you've talked a bit about how Holden's did build bodies for other brands. So there's one. The next question is, what other brands did the Holden Motor Body Shop build in the 1920s? So in those early days, before it had its own. So what were some of the other brands that they built bodies for? Don?
Look, I've got a list here which I think I can lay my hands on. I'll see if I can just get a list of all the different bodies they made. It was just huge. Let me just find the page, and can you go on to another question, please? I'll find the page.
Yeah, okay. We'll go on to the next question, and also rest assured we can get some information from Don and pass it on to all of our attendees later as well. This is a question for
here we are.
Yep, you found it?
Yeah, okay. 1927 to 29, Austin, Chrysler, Fiat, Falcon Knight, Hillman, Hudson, Morris Cowley, Morris Oxford, Overland, Whippet, Rover, Standard, Studebaker, Willys Knight, and Wolseley. 1930 to 35, Austin, Chrysler, DeSoto, Graham Page, Hillman, Morris Minor, Rio, Singer, Standard, Willys. How's that for a list?
Wow, that's super impressive. That's quite the list, isn't it? And Don has it all at his fingertips. Yeah, Mick?
Can I just quickly point out to anyone, this sounds like it might sound like an advertising pitch. For us, we don't make any money on them, and Don certainly doesn't because he volunteers on them. During the History Festival, Don and another volunteers of ours, Stuart Underwood, lead this tour of Holden history. That's just fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough. We literally charge as much as the bus tickets or the bus hire costs us. And if you're interested in that kind of history, you won't get you won't spend a better 4 or 5 hours of your life than joining that tour.
I would agree. They're so popular. Sorry, Don.
Kirsty, I just saw a flash on the screen that they built Oakland. Well, see, Oakland was General Motors. I've named all the makes that weren't General Motors. So just remember that General Motors consisted of, let's go up the ladder, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, the English Vauxhall, then the commercials. There were the Chevrolet and Bedford trucks, the GMC trucks as well. So we've got to remember all those were going down the line together with all these others. And when you think it was not computerized in any way at all, just the sheer logistics of managing that, I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, isn't it, when you think about that? It really is phenomenal.
And see, Oakland was a General Motors make that didn't last. They had some that were down market models, like the Viking was the cheap Oldsmobile, and that didn't last either. LaSalle was the cheap Cadillac, or cheaper Cadillac, I should say, and that didn't last either. So yes, you see all those old names on the buildings as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Listen, look, we've got lots more questions. We're going to answer a few more, but we just from experience, a number of people often have to leave us at about 6:30, and I'm guessing especially with COVID and the lockdown now 30 minutes in South Australia in particular, we may have some people leaving us. This will all be recorded and available on YouTube, so if you need to leave us now, you won't miss out. But we'll keep going with a few of the questions just because there's quite a few and there's some really interesting ones. So probably for you, Don and Mick, you talked a bit about that classic era and named some of the popular Holdens at the times, but what, in your view, what was the most popular Holden in the classic era? Or do you have a favourite?
If you'd like to donate to me a metallic green EH Premier station wagon, that would be very nice, thank you.
Oh my gosh, Don and I have the exact same favourite Holden in the exact same colour.
with tan interior.
If you go by numbers alone, the HK was the highest selling model of Holden. Sold like 500,000 of them, but it was, I think, I haven't actually drilled down into the numbers. That might also be because it was quite a long-lived one. It had a 3 and a bit year life, so they sold more. I mean, that 160,000 ish sold per year is not uncommon for the sort of mid 60s to the mid 70s.
What about the HQ, Mick?
Oh, sorry, HQ.
Yeah,
HQ.
Mm.
In terms of, yeah, I mean, there are a few sort of groundbreaking ones. I think the HK Monaro being the first is certainly one that is always put up the top of the list of people's significance. The FJ, you can't go past the FJ for significance, really, which was just an updated FX, but they, or 48215. Yeah, HQ, sorry, thanks, Jim, I got it wrong. Like I said, lots of codes to remember for a curator of motor museum across all marks.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Now we have, still quite a number of questions. Look, we're not going to get through all the questions tonight, but what we might do is we might call on Don and Mick to answer some of them offline. And then as we send out the recording to you all and to all of our Talking History followers, we'll try and get a bit more of that information, and we might even share some of Don's publications and some further reading for you. But there's a question about, I mean, obviously there are Holdens that now that are real collectibles. They're commanding high prices. Obviously the Motor Museum, the National Motor Museum, has the best examples, and you should get there to see them. But someone's asking, what are your thoughts on the high prices that they are commanding? Is it sustainable, and will that bubble burst?
Yeah, I'm not an economist. I mean, what is certain is that they are not going to build any more for the foreseeable future, and that supply only gets lower and lower. But yeah, in terms of the prices, it's hard to tell. I think historically you will find that these things are generational, so that my friends, I'm in my mid-30s, my friends are not the types who are probably going to go out and buy Australian muscle cars of the 70s when they have their midlife crises, which is where those sort of high hundreds, even into the millions now we are with the Holdens and Fords as well, are coming from. But yeah, it's very hard to say.
Yeah, I think possibly the closer you are to closing down of the Holden brand, those will increase, while perhaps the really early ones will gradually start to decrease. I think with the 48s and FJs, they stand out really as quite old-fashioned compared with the others. So they're almost curiosities. Now, when I drive my FJ, it's an attention getter, because if I had an FE or an FC, like the next pair of models, they look modern, whereas the 48s and FJs look a bit old-fashioned, and they're real attention getters. So fingers crossed. I'm hoping mine keeps up its value for a while, but I think it might. Look, in the end, I think it will tail off.
Although I have always said to people that, and my last comment on the economics of it all, because as motor museum curators, we're not really meant to comment on values. But I do always tell people, as a supporter of the historic vehicle movement, that people spend sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a fancy, Mercedes or whatever to make them stand out, and you can spend a fraction of that on you buy a minty green FJ Holden in two-tone, and I promise you that you will stand out more than in a $200,000 black on black on black Mercedes. So I think in that sense, they're a good investment.
Yes, there you go. You heard it here first. Look, there's one sort of to cast back to 1948 to sort of think a bit historically about Holden's, about how the dealership network was initially set up, and how they were distributed. How were the 1948 Holdens distributed?
Well, there were over 500 dealers around Australia. They had a wide distribution net. Now, in 1926, General Motors came here, and so a lot of dealerships started in 1926, and then that was increased, as the years went on. But by 1948, we've got 500. Now, that didn't include the dealers that missed out. The Vauxhall Pontiac dealers and Bedford, they continued then separately from the Holden dealers. So not every General Motors dealership got the franchise for the Holden. But nonetheless, there were 500 involved with the Holden distribution. So in Adelaide here, we had 3 distributors, and we had over 60 dealerships in South Australia. So even small country towns, like Butte and Yakka, they had their dealerships there. They were a very important part of the community.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess that's the Holden story generally, isn't it? They were such an important part of our history and the community, and whether it's social, economic, industrial, yes, such an important part, and yeah, integral to telling that Australian story and our history. Listen, thank you so much, Don and Mick. We are going to have to leave it here. We are well over time, but a number of people have stuck it out with us just because it's been such a fascinating conversation and Q&A at the end. Look, thank you so much. And I'm sure we will provide more opportunities in the future to Zoom you into the National Motor Museum at a time when South Australia isn't in a lockdown. But for now, it's been a fabulous sort of showcase of Holden's and the deep knowledge that we clearly have here in this Zoom room with Don and Mick. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, and thank you for all the questions. We haven't got through even half of them, which just tells you how engaged people have been, how engaged the audience have been. And we will call on the generosity of Don and Mick to answer some of those offline, and we'll get more information to all of you. And just a reminder, this talk is being recorded. We will email you when it's up on our YouTube and SoundCloud account. If you're interested in more talking histories, they cover a breadth of areas of South Australian and Australian history. Sometimes we get to showcase our fabulous museums. Sometimes it's a piece of research. Sometimes it's something amazing happening in the community. But do sign up on history.sa.gov.au if you're interested in tuning into future talking histories. And you can always watch our back catalogue on YouTube or listen to it on SoundCloud. So I guess that's it from us tonight. So thank you again to Don and Mick, and thank you to Catherine and Jade behind the scenes. Our technology did not fail tonight, which is just awesome. Yeah, I would encourage everyone to stay safe, stay warm, and stay connected in these really strange times. And thank you all again.